Good evening. I'm Jennifer McNally, and I serve as president of the board of the Bexley Public Library. On behalf of the board, I'm pleased to welcome you to the 2021 Bexley Community Authors Series. Simply put, tonight's program would not be possible without the generous support of our sponsors. We are especially grateful to Giant Eagle for continuing its commitment to education and community enrichment through their support as our benefactor sponsor. And special thanks for the support of our lead sponsors, Crane Group, Paige and Mike Crane, Linda and Frank Cass, the Friends of Bexley Public Library, and the Whitehall Bexley Rotary Club Foundation. We are also grateful to WCBE 90.5 FM, our media partner, for their help promoting this special event. And finally, big thanks to our host committee co-chairs, Doug and Amy Grace Ullman, and all of our host committee members and sponsors, too many to mention here, who value and exemplify a commitment to lifelong learning in our community. Now I'm pleased to introduce Ben Heckman, Director of Bexley Public Library, to tell you more about tonight's program.
Good evening and welcome to the Bexley Public Library. We're so happy for you to join us for the 2021 Bexley Community Author Series. We are thrilled to have Susan Orlean with us on what is sure to be a memorable evening. As Jennifer mentioned, the tireless enthusiasm and generosity of our sponsors has made this evening possible, and I'd like to thank them for their support. I'd also like to thank our wonderful team at the library who've ensured that 500 people who registered for tonight's event will safely be able to enjoy this evening's presentation. Ms. Orlean has written many exceptional books and articles, but obviously my personal favorite is the library book. The library book celebrates the history and importance of public libraries, the role they play in society, and how they can build communities. In the coming months, we'll be reaching out to our community to learn how the library can best serve you. I hope that you'll share your thoughts with us and be a part of the plan for the future of the Bexley Public Library. And now for the reason that we are all here. Heralded as a national treasure by the Washington Post, Susan Orlean's 1998 book, The Orchid Thief, inspired the Academy Award-winning film Adaptation, and she's a longtime staff writer at The New Yorker. Her newest release, the library book, was an instant New York Times bestseller and was named a top book by the Washington Post, the New York Times, and the Goodreads Book Club. Ms. Orlean will adopt the library book for a forthcoming series with Paramount TV. I'm honored to introduce Susan Orlean as our featured author for the 2021 Bexley Community Author Series.
Thank you. Thank you for having me, and thank you for everybody for attending. I wish I were there in person. I've been looking forward to this visit for a long time. I'm glad that we've been able to make it happen virtually. But as a native Ohioan, this was something that I've been looking forward to for a long time. So I will take a rain check for a future visit. I want to begin by reading a very short portion from the library book because I think it will give you a bit of a clue about what has driven me to be a writer. I grew up in libraries, or at least it feels that way. I was raised in the suburbs of Cleveland, just a few blocks from the brick-faced Bertram Woods branch of the Shaker Heights Public Library system. Throughout my childhood, starting when I was very young, I went there several times a week with my mother. On those visits, my mother and I walked in together, but as soon as we passed through the door, we split up and each headed to our favorite section. The library might have been the first place I was ever given autonomy. Even when I was maybe 4 or 5 years old, I was allowed to head off on my own. Then after a while, my mother and I reunited at the checkout counter with our finds. Together we waited as the librarian pulled out the date card and stamped it with the checkout machine. That giant fist thumping the card with a loud chunk chunk printing a crooked due date underneath a score of previous crooked due dates that belonged to other people, other times. Our visits to the library were never long enough for me. The place was so bountiful. I loved wandering around the bookshelves, scanning the spines until something happened to catch my eye. Those visits were dreamy, frictionless interludes that promised I would leave richer than I arrived. It wasn't like going to the store with my mom, which guaranteed a tug of war between what I wanted and what my mother was willing to buy me. In the library, I could have anything I wanted. After we checked out, I loved being in the car and having all the books we'd gotten stacked on my lap, pressing me under their solid, warm weight. It was such a thrill leaving a place with things you hadn't paid for. Such a thrill anticipating the new books we would read. On the ride home, my mom and I talked about the order in which we were going to read our books and how long until they had to be returned. A solemn conversation in which we decided how to pace ourselves through this charmed, evanescent period of grace until the books were due. We both thought all of the librarians at the Bertram Woods Branch Library were beautiful. For a few minutes, we would discuss their beauty. My mother then always mentioned that if she had chosen any profession at all, she would have chosen to be a librarian. And the car would grow silent for a moment as we both considered what an amazing thing that would have been. When I was older, I usually walked to the library myself. Occasionally, I did go with my mother. Even when I was in my last year of high school and could drive myself to the library, my mother and I still went together now and then. And the trip unfolded exactly as it did when I was a child, with all the same beats and pauses and comments and reveries, the same perfect pensive rhythm we followed so many times before. When I miss my mother these days, now that she is gone, I like to picture us in the car together, going for one more magnificent trip to Bertram Woods. So why did I write this book? And I think that this is a question that really addresses the entire question of what drives me as a writer. Now, I obviously was a person who loved libraries, but that alone isn't the clue to what motivates you to write a book, because not everything you love has the narrative arc to make a great story. And in fact, for a while, I began thinking that I'd love to write a book about libraries, but I couldn't figure out what the story would be. What could I say that could drive a reader through 350 pages if I didn't have some dramatic turn? And libraries, arguably, are not dramatic. I say this with all great affection, but they don't automatically have the makings of a dramatic story. So it was something that kind of knocked around in my head for years. And this is often the way that I come to write what I write about. Something that I experience in my everyday life seems suddenly to be mysterious. Something that had been very ordinary becomes fascinating to me because I realize how little I really know about it. And that was exactly what happened to me with libraries. It was a place that I had been hundreds and hundreds of times in my life. But when I stopped and thought about it as a writer and really contemplated it as a story, I realized that I actually didn't know anything about libraries. And I love that way into a story, to take my assumed knowledge and examine it and realize that I really don't know how something works, or I don't know a place as well as I thought I did. And that was certainly the underpinning of The Orchid Thief, was believing that I knew Florida very well, and then realizing I didn't know it at all. So this is what happened with the library. But let me tell you how this truly came to a head and became a book. I had considered this idea and shelved it because I couldn't see how to frame it as a narrative story. I had just moved to Los Angeles, and I was taking my son to the library. He had a school assignment to interview a public servant. I had suggested that he interview a garbage collector, and he completely surprised me and suggested that he wanted to interview a librarian. He was about 5 years old at the time. So I was pretty impressed with my parenting. I thought, I've created a child who's curious about librarians. It's pretty good. We were so new to LA, we didn't even know where our local library was. We looked it up, headed over there so he could interview the librarian. And when we walked into the library, I was overwhelmed with this sense of familiarity, the sense that this was exactly the place that I had gone time and time again as a child. And certainly there was a lot of emotion connected to going with my own child and repeating the exact ritual of going with my mom that had been so important to my life. And I was really moved by this memory. I thought, why is this so emotional? I went lots of places with my mother, and it struck me that this was the place that I felt the most connection to, that I had the most emotional response to, was this idea of these trips to the library with my mom. And it registered for me in a very powerful way. There was something about a library that had an emotional impact that I really hadn't anticipated and that I couldn't quite figure out. Soon after that, I was invited to tour the main library in LA, and I had never visited it. So I was very excited about seeing it. This offer was made to me at a time when I didn't even know LA had a downtown, let alone a downtown library. So I was pretty thrilled to go down there. The LA Library building is pretty spectacular, and so I immediately was enthralled before I even got in the door. As we were walking through the library, the man who was the head of the Library Foundation was giving me the tour, and he was showing me all the parts of the library and telling me stories of previous heads of the library and patrons and stories about the librarians. And I was really overwhelmed by the sense that this was a place simply exploding with stories, both literal and figurative. This was the repository of all of the stories that had been written and were collected in books there, but that the building itself and the institution of the library had this wonderful history. We stopped in front of one of the rows of fiction books, and he pulled a book off the shelf, and he took a whiff of the book. And then he said to me, you know, you can still smell the smoke in some of them. And I didn't know what he meant. I thought for a minute, and I said, did they used to let people smoke in the library? And he said, no, they not smoke from cigarettes, smoke from the fire. And I said, from what fire? He said, the big fire in 1986, it closed the library for 7 years. And at that minute, as he said those words, I knew that I had my story. And it wasn't just that it was a dramatic story that was worth telling, but that the idea of books burning had an enormous effect on me. It's something that I think just about anybody react to as if it's almost a human loss. when I'm writing, what I really look for are those layers of meaning. And to me, this was so layered. I mean, libraries mean so much to us as places of community gathering, of essentially the archives of all of our stories that have been told and written over time immemorial. But we also have this deeper feeling of books almost seeming human. That was something I had never really considered, even though I knew from my own experience that I had trouble ever throwing out a book, even if it was falling apart or even if it was a book I knew I would never read. I have a feeling most of you would share the same feeling. I mean, I've never thrown a book out. I'll hold on to a book forever, even if I don't want it, if I can't figure out what else to do with it, because it feels human in a way that is hard to really understand. I don't think there's any other object in our life that we feel that same sense of having a soul, besides our pets, of course, but a non-living thing that feels so alive. Certainly, there's the fact that I'm a writer. I probably have an even deeper feeling about the sense of books being alive. But I think it's a human thing. I think it's a human response to books, whether it's that they just have come to be the perfect receptacle for stories and fantasies and information, ideas. This is the way we've been sharing our stories for so long. And they feel human. They take on a quality that seems very human to me. So I knew the minute that I heard about the fire that this was a story that I wanted to write, and that I felt actually duty bound to write. It was astonishing to me that the largest library fire in American history was so little known and had been so barely covered in the media. So it was a really a sense of almost necessity to me to tell the story. Now, I want to backtrack a little and ask a question that I'm often asked, because I think it'll be particularly relevant to all of you. And I think it's meaningful in this context, because I'm often asked, do I think being a Midwesterner had an effect on my becoming a writer or the kind of writer that I am? And my answer to that is a resounding yes. A lot of answers to why. Number one, I had a wonderful education. And I think Ohio has always been a place full of great educational systems. And certainly I grew up with a great education, great teachers who inspired me. But I think there's something else beyond that. I think growing up in the Midwest, you are always aware that there's something above you, something below you, something to the left of you, and something to the right of you. We are in the middle of the country, which makes you feel that your perspective has to be 360 to really understand who you are. You need to look in all of these directions. And it's very different now that I live in Los Angeles. And I realize that you don't have that sense of centrality, and you don't feel that you have this sort of fisheye camera view of the world. And I really grew up with that sense that it was necessary and valuable for me to look in all of those directions. That being in Ohio was wonderful, but it really served as a platform for me to look around the world. not everybody who grows up in Ohio ends up being a writer, but I think the attitude of being a Midwesterner is really significant for me. It really made me a curious person. It made me eager to explore. It filled me with the sense that there was a lot that I wanted to learn, that as much as my childhood was very happy and very satisfying, there always was a sense to me that I should explore. I should learn what's above me, what's below me, what's to the left and what's to the right. And that set me out on a path of curiosity. It's my one tool, besides a pretty good computer, that I feel that I couldn't do without. And that is that sense of having an open mind, an open heart, open eyes to see the world and to ask questions about the world around me. So I feel very grateful having grown up somewhere that I really think inspired me to stay open in that way. There is no way you can be a writer without that kind of curiosity and that kind of openness, the receptivity to the world around you, and the ability to look at something ordinary, something familiar, and ask a question about it and say, what can I learn about this? I mean, that, I think really my career has been that of a student. And very often I see my job as being a student when there's something I'm curious about, and then becoming a teacher once I've learned a lot about it. In the case of the library, I entered this whole story entirely as a student. I was new to LA. I could barely find my way downtown. I knew nothing of LA history. And I was a citizen user of libraries with very, very little knowledge about how libraries operated. I knew very little about arson. I'm glad of that. And I really knew so little about the impact and the story of libraries throughout our history, and the story of all the burned libraries throughout history. So I became a student for several years until I felt that I was ready to be a teacher. And being a teacher meant writing the book and telling the story. So I feel very lucky in my job to be always entering the world with the student's mind, and ultimately with the teacher's mastery of a subject that I can then share with readers, and hope that I can excite them about the subject as much as I've been excited. I wish I had more time. I think we're going to turn now to a Q&A, which I'm also looking forward to. And I want to thank you all again for being here tonight.
And thank you so much, Ms. Orlean. And thank you to everyone who submitted questions prior to the program. If you'd like to ask a question, feel free to submit it now using the Q&A feature on Zoom. Time permitting, Dr. Garcia will incorporate additional questions at the end of her conversation with Ms. Orlean. With that said, I would like to now welcome Dr. Ivonne Garcia. Dr. Ivonne M. Garcia is the inaugural Chief Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Officer at the College of Wooster. Prior to that, she was the William P. Rice Associate Professor of English and Literature at Kenyon College, where she also was the inaugural Associate Provost for Diversity and Inclusion. She holds doctorate and master's degrees in English from The Ohio State University, a master's in administration, planning, and social policy from the Harvard Graduate School of Education, and a bachelor's in history and literature of Latin American from Harvard. She was an award-winning journalist and editor in Puerto Rico for more than a decade and has lived in Bexley for 14 years. In June, she will begin a new position as Senior Instructional Coach for Anti-Racist Pedagogy at Harvard Graduate School of Education. Please welcome Dr. Ivonne Garcia.
Thank you so much, Ben. Thank you, everybody, for being here. I am just thrilled to get to ask you questions for a few minutes. As we noted, most of the questions I'm going to ask you came from the audience prior to this conversation that we're going to have tonight. And I'm also going to try to incorporate some of the questions that are coming in as we speak. So thank you so much for your willingness to be here with us tonight. So the first question that our writers wanted to know, our readers and our audience wanted to know about, many of whom I'm sure are writers too. Did you plan to write the book as both a story about the fire and a history of the library, or did that evolve during your writing process? And then could you talk about, like, how is it that you became the person who wrote this story? Had it already been written about in other contexts that were not in newspapers specifically?
Well, those are both great questions. I initially thought, oh, I'm going to write this crime story. I'm going to tell the story of the fire. I'm going to solve the mystery of who set the fire. In fact, I even told my publisher that I was going to solve this mystery, which is crazy. And when I began looking into it, I realized, and this is absolutely true in every story, I don't think that you can tell a story about a singular event without context. To me, it didn't make sense to tell the story of the fire and the destruction of the library without telling the story of the origin of the library. But more importantly, it felt really significant to me to tell the story of the meaning and importance of libraries, so that the point of a fire and the destruction of the fire had meaning. That, you know, certainly you don't just go replace 400,000 books. It wasn't simply a matter of money. But realizing that there was a long history of library burning and book burning, and the emotional and social meaning of burning books became unavoidable. I mean, this mattered to me more than just this was a single event that happened in LA. This was this profound human reaction to the idea of books burning. And why do we react that way? To me, it was fascinating to explore that. The fire had been written about in newspapers. There was coverage, and certainly there was coverage in the LA papers. The coverage elsewhere was really buried, and I talked about that in the book. I was really surprised that it hadn't made the front page of the New York Times, because this was a major civic event. And New York is the center of publishing, and you would think that, of course, this would be the kind of story that would run on the front page below the fold. So I went back to look at the New York Times from that day, just out of curiosity, thinking, well, why didn't this get more coverage? And of course, the headline of the paper on that day was something to the effect of "Soviets deny meltdown at Chernobyl nuclear plant." Mm-hmm. So I was immediately aware of why the coverage of this got submerged, because the world was teetering on the brink of possible destruction, a complete global destruction. I was suddenly reminded of what it was like to live through Chernobyl, and remembering that we had no idea what was going to happen. Mm-hmm. So it was and I love writing about stories that historical events that somehow, because of circumstance, because of the moment, missed getting the attention that that they might have otherwise. And so this story absolutely fell into that category.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. That is a great answer to the question. I'm going to sort of insert my own question here quickly, because I noticed, the book, and you were holding it, and I loved your dog ears and all the,
My copy is not in good shape.
So my question to you is, how much influence did you have in the design of the book and the pages? Because this to me felt, when the library was so kind to give me a copy, I felt, wow, this is a book. Like the red, it made me think, of course, of Dickens and A Christmas Carol, and how involved he was in the design of everything. And also the quality of the pages, right? Like the quality of the paper, the thickness of the pages. It seemed to me, this is an author who wants to make a statement about the book, not just write and publish a book. Can you say a little more about how involved were you in the creation of the artifact itself, right? I'm very curious to know.
Well, I'm delighted every time I hear someone responding to how special an object it is. It seemed to me that we had to make a statement with the physical book itself, because the book was celebrating very much the physical entity of a book, and was meditating on the connection that we feel with books. So it seemed absolutely essential that we make the book speak volumes, no pun intended, about the idea of a physical book. From the very beginning, I knew that I only wanted text on the cover, and I didn't want, we have a tiny image of a flame, but mostly I wanted it just to be text, and that it should look, in a sense, like a library book. Mm-hmm. So I got very involved, and perhaps more involved than I have been on other books of mine, because I felt so strongly about, and we all agreed, my publisher absolutely agreed, that this had to be distinctive. It had to be the sort of meta book. It had to be a book that looked like it was about books, if that makes any sense. And it was, the art direction obviously came from the art director, and she did an incredible job. But we were all very involved in making decisions and deciding to do the checkout card and the back jacket here.
You can almost touch it, it's hard to put your finger on it and find that you can't, that doesn't have
when I first got my copy, I thought, oh my God, they really did put those envelopes in. And I had to reach out and touch it to realize that it wasn't an actual three-dimensional item.
Yeah, it's beautiful. So thank you so much for answering that question. So our next question is about your writing process. So you can see the room here at the Bexley Public Library. It's a beautiful room. You're there in this beautiful, patio-looking structure. What is your writing room or rooms? And how old were you when you first wrote a book, or thought you wrote a book? Or when you imagined yourself, right, saying, hey, I'm ready to write a book?
I wanted to be a writer from the time I first learned to read. Wow. I never really wanted to be anything else, which either means I have no imagination, or I knew early on what I wanted to do. I wrote my first book when I was really young. My mom always claims that I was 5, and it was, of course, a very, I would say, pretty crude little book, but it was a story. It was fiction about a pigeon who couldn't see well and needed glasses, and his journey to getting his glasses. And improving his eyesight, I knew, or I should say I felt from the very beginning that writing was magic. To me, reading was magic. So the idea that you could simply put words on a page and give someone an experience was unimaginable. It was alchemy. It was incredible. It always fascinated me and made me want to do it. I knew early on also that as much as I love fiction and I read a lot of fiction, I always wanted to write nonfiction. I think that part of me that was curious about the way the world works made me want to write, to explore real stories rather than make up stories. I have enormous admiration for fiction writers and feel that I can't imagine being able to dream up a story. I'm much better at ferreting out a story in the real world. And that's not easy, but it means that I'm not, and the fact is I would never be able to imagine many of the stories that I've written. I would never have dreamed of them. They're too surprising to me. My writing process in general is I do all of my research and reporting before I write. I feel like I really need to know the story before I begin writing the story. So that's my hands down the most inviolable rule of my writing is that I do all the reporting first. So sometimes years go by before I've written a word, which is very unnerving, but I don't think I can tell the story until I know the whole story. And then I can write really anywhere. I have a wonderful little private office that's about 100 yards from my house. And that to me is kind of ideal, that I can shut the door and it's really my own space. But I've written in hotel rooms. I've written at coffee shops. I've written a lot of places that are less than ideal. So I'm able to write if I know what I want to say. I can really write anywhere. But given the choice, I'd rather be in a quiet space of my own without anyone being able to interrupt me.
So, just a follow-up question. So a lot of writers say they have to know the ending before they know where to start. So to your point that you have to finish all of this amazing research, right? And a lot of the questions are going and a lot of the kudos are going to all the research that you've done and, to the quality of those years that you put into the investigation. But I wonder, do you prepare a storyboard? Like, do you know where you want to end and then you build back? Or do you say, well, I sort of want to start here and then I want to move in parts 1, part 2, part 3? Or does the book speak to you as you're writing it?
It's a little bit of both. I mean, that's a great question because to me, structure is the most important invisible quality of a good piece of writing. I think it's something that as a reader, you should never be aware of. But as a writer, you are painfully aware that the whole book sort of rises and falls on the structure, and particularly when you have huge amounts of information, which I certainly did. And I was telling all of these different stories. I was telling the history of libraries in America. I was telling the story of arson and arson investigation. I was telling the story of the young man accused of the fire. I was telling the story of my own childhood and my growing up, falling in love with libraries. And that's just a few of the stories I was telling. There were many stories. So part of the problem was trying to figure out, how do I organize this in a way that keeps the reader moving forward? I didn't really know where I would end, but I organized my material thematically. I knew that there would have to be a certain amount of chronology in terms of being able to tell the story of the fire. But what I really did was organize the material thematically, that this was a whole chunk about the burned libraries throughout history. And why that's meaningful. And this is an entire chunk about the vulnerability of arson investigation and how difficult it is and how possibly faulty it is. And so each of these things seem to collect into a trough of information. There were all of the stories of the individual heads of the library in LA who were such fascinating characters to me that I couldn't not tell their stories. And then there was the story of the present day library, because part of what I wanted to do with the book was to portray to the reader the day-to-day life in a library, really looking from inside out, because most of us as patrons of libraries know exactly what it feels like for us to go into the library. I was really curious to see it from the insider's view looking out. So this was a lot of threads to keep going at once and to keep organized. And I felt confident that they would lead me to the right ending, that if I played each of them out, that they would lead me very naturally to an ending that was organically correct. And I feel like it did.
Yeah, that is fascinating. It's almost like you're putting together a kind of quilt, right? That you're not sure what it's going to look like when you finish, but by the time you've started building it, then you know, right? Like, this is the quilt that I have.
Yeah, well, it becomes inevitable in a way that's really interesting. There's a point at which it's like doing a jigsaw puzzle, and you maybe start on the edges, as everybody knows. That's the good cheat to get you sort of make progress on a jigsaw puzzle, but then you're piecing things together, and as you go toward the end, it becomes very obvious where you need to go.
That sounds fantastic. Thank you so much for sharing that. A lot of our audience also wanted to talk to you about your characterization. So, you know, again, you talk a lot about the individual librarians, and you must have felt like, you know, to your point, that you really thought you were writing a crime story and you were going to solve a crime. It must have felt, as any good journalist, right? Like, you feel like you come into this treasure of like, oh my God, these people are really interesting. And I had no idea, right? Like, that the history of one person can be so dramatic, and every one of them, right, lives up to that. But how do you build those characters, right? Like, so you have to select, what are you going to choose? What are you going to leave out? Because you're not writing a biography of these people. So can you talk a little bit about your characterization, that process? Do the people that you write about or their descendants get upset about the portrayal, since you're talking about people who lived or are alive? And do you check in with them before you publish? A lot of nonfiction writers do tend to, or some nonfiction writers do tend to talk to their subjects that they're characterizing. Second language speaker. So so if you can speak a little bit about your process of developing character, right? Mm-hmm. Especially with actual non-fictional people.
Right. Well, I think the first thing that is my guiding principle is my main interest is to be fair. And that doesn't mean I'm characterizing everybody in the most glowing terms or the most negative terms. It just means that I need to feel that I've been fair, and that guides me. I don't go back and review quotes and so forth with people. As a rule, certainly when I write for the New Yorker, the fact checkers go through details to make sure everything that we're portraying is factually correct. And to some degree, I mean, I had a fact checker work on the book because there was so much information. Yeah. And I thought I need someone else to double check my facts. So I hired a fact checker to go through. Now, that's not the same as, there are certain things in characterizing people that are not technically factual. Mm-hmm. But I kind of go with my gut. I feel like I don't have an agenda. I'm not looking to portray someone one way or the other, so that my sense of them feels to me pretty, I can trust myself. I don't come in with a point that I'm trying to prove. It's very, very different from someone who is making an argument. I had no argument to make. I wasn't looking to support a position that I had. I was looking to tell the story. Now, characterizing people is really challenging. It's I think a book like this rises and falls on whether you make people come to life and create portraits of people that are really interesting, but you also need to be very economical. And you don't have endless numbers of pages to characterize each and every person. So it comes down to being more like a quick sketch artist as opposed to a photorealist. I can't portray every detail of someone, but I hope that my eye has been trained to seize on details that will quickly give you a sense of someone. Will you be able to pick them out of a crowd? I'm not sure, but do you have a sense of what this person is like in using a very economical amount of description? I hope so. And in that case, I rely on first reaction, my sense, my takeaway. What is it that I really remember about someone after I've met them? That's often, even though that sounds very simple, that's often the best tool, which is to say to yourself, what struck me about them immediately? What is it that I remember most distinctly about them? Because that is going to be the little pencil line that you make that makes a reader go, oh, I can picture this person. Well, it's really fun. It's fun to do. It's challenging to do. Yeah. And I had a lot of characters in this book.
Well, I have to say that it's superb. I mean, I find that you humanized them, you brought them to life with what other people would say simple details, like you just said, but very, very, just beautifully done, right? Like the clothes they wear or their demeanor. And, you have to be a very attentive person to really capture. And again, what I used to tell my students when I taught literature, when I teach literature, is that's all done with little scratches on a page.
Right.
Like you're not actually sketching a picture. You're not filming, which the brain immediately understands. You have to parse it out through the words, which is, the art.
Right. And in this case too, I wanted to make this feel like a very populated book that was just filled with people. So there were a few people who I absolutely needed and wanted to flesh out their portrait. And there were a few people who I became so fascinated by that I couldn't stop myself. I just wanted to, particularly The early heads of the LA Library, who were just extraordinary characters, and I couldn't stop myself. I mean, I had originally thought these would be very brief portraits, but they became so interesting to me, and they ended up, I realized in retrospect, were so meaningful in the way this institution developed, and they captured their time so explicitly that they ended up really just captivating me, and their stories really were unexpected. I never dreamed that would be a significant part of the book, and it really was.
Totally. Thank you so much. This has been just a wonderful conversation. I think we are going to try to make some time for the audience to ask questions. So I think we are going to have some slides. So I'm happy to read them out loud.
Oh, okay.
So
I can, well, sure, if you'd like,
let's not, because that takes time, unless, it's helpful to people on the call.
Oh, okay. So this the question about adaptation. I initially was just told that someone was optioning my book, and I couldn't imagine how the book would be adapted for a movie. It never, ever seemed like a movie to me. And when I got the script, I was completely shocked. I also said that they couldn't use my name because I was really concerned that people would take at face value the film and believe that I had done all of the things that were portrayed in the film. Starting about halfway through the movie, it's all fictitious, which I'm sure most people who've seen the movie have figured out. But I was very concerned and initially said no. And then slowly they wore me down. And as somebody who has a hard time saying no, I said yes. Certainly when they told me Meryl Streep was portraying me, I felt a huge amount of relief, because I thought, I know that this will be good no matter what, and that it would have dignity no matter what, even if it was me snorting orchid powder and, shooting a federal agent, it would be done with dignity. So I was involved. I was certainly involved in giving my permission, and I watched them film a certain amount of it, and felt very connected to the project all along.
I think we're going to get another question.
Oh, well, this is a great question. People ask this all the time, and I think it's such an interesting question. And when electronic media first became widely available, everybody was predicting that this was the end of libraries, that everybody would gravitate to electronic media, and there would be what would be the point of having a library? You would simply log on and download the book you were borrowing, and that would be that. And it hasn't turned out that way. And it hasn't turned out that way at all, as a matter of fact. And I do think we are on what I believe is the cusp of a real upswing in the library's role in society. I think certainly the pandemic, as far as we can tell, is going to mean many more people working from home. Libraries are an absolutely perfect resource for people who work at home, even if it's simply to bring your computer and sit in a beautiful room and work somewhere that's not home, and you don't want to sit in Starbucks all day long, and where you have a very small table and you have to keep buying coffee. Libraries are the original, the sort of quintessential we work. They provide a place for people who work from home to work somewhere other than from home. But in addition, libraries very wisely began recasting themselves as places where things happen in real time and in real life. Speaker series, classes, kids' story time. There's so many things that happen at libraries, and they happen in the real world, in real time, and they need a place to occur. And one final thing on this, because I think there really was so much of an assumption that people would migrate to ebooks. Ebooks play a very important role. They've been a very successful, very valuable addition to the way we consume media, but they've leveled out. And it's sort of assumed that we've reached a point where e-media has saturated to where it's going to saturate, and it's not going to keep going up and up and up. There are certain genres that work really well as ebooks, and a whole lot of books that do not. And there are also, we've kind of gotten to the point where everyone who wants to use e-readers are using them, and it doesn't seem to be growing. It seems to have kind of hit its sort of balance point. So the idea that every book in the library will be replaced by some digital code, I don't think is going to happen. I think we've kind of reached that the balance point of that. Oh my God, I loved, well, the first books that I read with just undying passion were any books about animals, and particularly about horses when I was a kid. All of those Marguerite Henry books, Misty of Chincoteague, all of her books were like the gospel for me. I mean, they were the books that really mattered to me when I was a kid. So any books about animals really were formative for me. And as I got older, I continued reading fiction, and I sort of went into the whole sort of Bronte and Bronte-like books that I think a lot of young girls fall in love with because they're romantic and dramatic and full of sort of fantasies of what adult life is really all about. But I wouldn't say I had a favorite section of the library because I just sort of loved it all. I love maps. I love atlases. I love all of it. I love the history section. I love cookbooks. I kind of love it all.
Great. Do we have one more? Yes.
My favorite characters from the library book. Well, my secret favorite character was Charles Lummis, who ran the library for 5 years at the turn of the century. I became so fascinated by him that there was a point where I began thinking, am I writing a book about Charles Lummis instead of the book I thought I was writing? Because his life was so extraordinary. He was such an eccentric. He was such a visionary. He was such a contradiction. This was a man who was incredibly progressive in certain ways and an unbelievable misogynist and sexist, and had so many failings and frailties of his time. He was so vain, but he was also so civic-minded. There was something about him that just fascinated me. And he really was a character who lived beyond the sort of boundaries of his moment. So it was kind of hard to resist the temptation to spend even more pages on him than I did, but there was a point where I thought I have to stop, because otherwise this really does become the book of Charles Lummis and not the library book. But I loved writing about him.
And it shows, I think, absolutely, total, yeah, the whole book. So thank you so much. We do want you to get a chance to tell us a little bit. We know you have a book on essays on animals that you're working on. You
Right.
talked about it at the podcast that you had with Bexley Public Library that Ben mentioned, which was marvelous. Do you want to say a little more about your memoir and kind of tell us like what
Sure.
we expect and when?
Yes. Well, first of all, I'll say my collection about animals, which is called On Animals, is coming out in October. So I'm really excited about that. And it almost feels like tomorrow. It feels like it will be that fast. And I'm writing a memoir. It's funny. I'm so used to writing about other people that it's been a little bit of an effort to force myself to write a memoir. And of course, I look at my life and it's just my life. I don't look at it as being exceptional in any way. And then now and again, I'm reminded that I have really had opportunities and experiences that have been pretty extraordinary. In order to help me get over my resistance to writing about myself, I've had someone interviewing me so that I don't have to interview myself. And that's been a very helpful tool in working on the memoir. I don't have a publication date for it yet, but I hope it won't be too far in the future.
Well, thank you so much. That sounds just so interesting, the way that the process, again, the structure is working. So we will very much look forward to that. Thank you so much for being with us. I'm going to hand it over to Ben.
Well, I just want to thank you both very much, Ms. Orlean. What an amazing presentation. And Dr. Garcia, thank you for the question and answers session. I want to thank you all for coming tonight. We hope to see you next Thursday at 7 p.m. for our author event with the National Book Award winner, Elizabeth Acevedo and Mahogany Brown. We hope that you all get home safe and have a wonderful evening. We look forward to seeing you all next year. Thanks for being here with us.
Thank you so much.